Want to welcome everyone here today. Thank you for coming to our Caregiver Conference. My name is Kristen Fleming, and I work for the Alzheimer's Disease Caregiver Support Initiative out of the Center for Neurobehavioral Health at SUNY Plattsburgh. We have a grant from the New York State Department of Health to provide services for caregivers in 6 counties. They're Clinton, Franklin, Essex, Warren, Washington, and Hamilton. And we do that through 6 service areas: respite, care consultations, memory cafes, support groups, education services, and Project Lifesaver. I do have a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. So you all are in a listen-only mode, which means I cannot see or hear you. However, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box or the Q&A feature, and I will be moderating a question and answer session at the end. I also want to let you know that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available for replay at a later date. Now, let me introduce you to our speaker today. Jim Comer is an author, speech coach, and communication consultant. His book, When Roles Reverse, A Guide to Parenting Your Parents, was nominated by the Texas Writers League as Best Nonfiction Book of 2007. Jim's articles have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Reader's Digest. As a speaker, Jim has informed, inspired, and entertained audiences from Cancun, Mexico to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And we're glad to have him here today from sunny Austin, Texas. So without further ado, please welcome Jim Comer.
I wear this every time I go outside, but I'm so thrilled not to wear it for the next hour. I'm really glad to be speaking to you in upstate New York. I was in Plattsburgh about 4 years ago this fall, and we had a terrific afternoon, and I just enjoyed so much being with you in person. Today, it's a little different. I'm coming to you via Zoom. And for somebody like me, who loves to make eye contact and move all around the room and all over the stage, and then go into the audience and really see your faces and hear your laughter, well, this is different. But I think it's gonna be good because I get to come to you over TV. Like, this is as close to being Jimmy Fallon or Stephen Colbert as I am ever going to get. I wanna start by acknowledging you and acknowledging the fact that this is a time like no other for caregivers. You are faced with an absolutely unprecedented situation. Not only do you have to do the normal work of caregiving, but you have to deal with sheltering in place and worrying about your health and the health of those you love. And if they're in a care community or a hospital, you may not be able to go to see them at all or as much as you want. So you're in uncharted territory. But you'll survive and you'll thrive in this because that's what we have to do. Dory told me a story about one of the caregivers who's probably listening today. She's a woman who was caring for her husband at home, and she had good support. She had nurses coming in a couple of times a week. She was very involved with the Caregiver Support Initiative. She went to the support group and respite group and memory cafe. So she got a lot of support. And then over the last few months, her husband's condition worsened and he began to get angry and combative. And she realized that she just could not care for him at home as she had been doing. So she had to put him into a hospital. And at the hospital, they told her she could only come see him if his condition was grave. And a couple of times it was grave. In fact, they told her they didn't think he would live, but he survived. And after a number of weeks, they were finally able to get him into a bed in a nursing home. But by that time, she was exhausted, mentally and physically. But she kept showing up for her husband. She did what she had to do. She put one foot in front of another, and she didn't stop no matter what. And I know that that's true in many different ways for all of you listening today. You know, former First Lady Rosalind Carter, said there are 4 kinds of people in the world. People who have been caregivers, people who are currently caregivers, people who are going to be caregivers, and those who are going to need caregiving. Well, I have been in 3 of those groups, and you know which one is left. Today, I'm talking to caregivers and professionals who work with you. And I'm going to do my best to tell you my ups and downs of caring for my parents. And I must start off by telling you, there has never been a least likely caregiver in human history than me. I knew nothing going into it, no background at all, which meant I faked it a lot. I improvised, I prayed, I asked questions, and yes, indeed, I put one foot in front of the other. And as a result of that, I was a caregiver for 14 years, 3,280 days. And I guess I did okay. Today, I'm going to take you back to the very first day my caregiving journey began. February the 20th, 1996. I was living in Los Angeles, working as a speechwriter for a CEO of a big company. I'm sound asleep, 7 a.m. The phone rings. Hello? Hello? Lisa? Lisa Huff? Lisa Huff was my parents' next door neighbor in Dallas, Texas. In 34 years of living next to my parents, she had never called me. My whole body braced for bad news, and it wasn't long in coming. She said, Jim, your daddy is wandering around in the front yard, and he looks like he's in a daze. I'm afraid he's having a stroke. Well, I hung up from her, called home, tried to get my father to come to the phone, but he wouldn't come. I could hear him yelling in the backyard, but he would not come. And in that moment, I realized that Lisa's sidewalk diagnosis was true. He was having a stroke. Caring for my mother, who had early Alzheimer's, had been too much for him. So within 6 or 7 hours, I was on a plane from LA to Dallas. And you know how the neighbors got my father to go to the hospital? They told him he was going for Mexican food. In Texas, that's how you get people to do something. You tell them they're going for Mexican food. So he went to the hospital. So I show up probably about 7 o'clock that night at the intensive care. And as I'm walking in, there are the friends and the neighbors, they're gathered, and they're looking at me with this look that says, thank goodness, the man with all the answers has arrived. You think I had all the answers? I didn't even know the questions because my father wouldn't talk to me about anything. But he was in terrible shape. He could not walk, talk, and had no control of his bodily functions. And my mother had no idea what had happened. The hospital officials let me know within 15 minutes that he could only stay there 1 week, and then he had to be in rehab. And here was the problem. We didn't have any family in Dallas. They'd been there a long time, but no family, good friends and neighbors. But when things go wrong, friends and neighbors are great, but family is essential. And our family was 200 miles south in Austin. So 2 days later, I took the plane down to Austin in a rainstorm, and my cousins met me, and we began to look for rehab centers. We went to 4 different rehab centers in one afternoon, and they all looked the same to me because I'd never been to one before. I had no idea what to look for. Finally, the 4th one, St. David's, a nurse smiled at me. I needed a smile so bad that week. And I just hoped that all of St. David's was as friendly and welcoming as that nurse. So I chose St. David's because of her smile. I'm not kidding. And then they told me that they would bring my father down the next Monday in an ambulance and that Medicare would pay for it. And when I got home to Dallas that night and I told my mother about Medicare paying for it, she says, honey, you think they can afford it? I think my mother was ahead of the game, don't you? Well, then, of course, the problem became her. Because you see, she had been taken care of by my father, but he wasn't there. And she didn't realize how dependent she was. She said in her sweet Southern Belle way, she said, now, Jim, it's okay for Daddy to go down to Austin if he must, but I am staying right here in Dallas. I am not leaving my home. Well, of course, she couldn't stay there, but she didn't know it. So I had to come up with a solution. Now, my cousins in Austin, they volunteered to keep my mother for 4 or 5 weeks until I could decide what to do, but I had to get her to Austin. So as the week went on, it's now Sunday, the day before my father's going down in the ambulance. I'm going, what do I do? And okay, then I came up with an idea. I packed for my mother, and if you can imagine how badly I packed, that's exactly how bad. I just put her stuff in the trunk, and I did that Sunday night, and then I came up with a great scientific terminology of how to deal with mother's issue. I call it therapeutic lying. Yeah, that's therapeutic lying. You'll want to know that word because you may use it. The next morning, Monday morning, it's 8:30, I came down to my mother, and she's sitting at her breakfast table drinking her coffee, and I told a whopper. I said, Mom, how would you like to go get some ice cream? Now, my mother never turns down ice cream. Not even at 8:30 on a Monday morning. She smiled, brightened, got right up, put her coffee down, and she walked with me to the car, opened the door, she got in, and we drove away from her home of 34 years. And she never saw it again. Now, I don't want you to think I'm a bad guy. The first Dairy Queen we came to, stopped on those brakes. I went and I got her the biggest, gooeyest chocolate sundae you have ever seen. And I gave it to her. She was very happy. And then I headed down I-35 toward Austin. And I kept waiting for her to say something. But she said nothing. She finished the ice cream, and then I was waiting. And sometime around Waco, I just knew I'd hear from her. No, she was talking about the colors of passing cars. She spent about an hour commenting on that. And I was thrilled because I got her to Austin, took her to my cousin's house, kissed her goodbye, and headed for the airport. I'd been gone 11 days from my job. Well, I thought, well, I dodged one bullet, but of course, my life was never the same. 2 weeks later, I was back to check on my dad, see how he was doing in rehab. And I walked up to the rehab, he was on the 4th floor, walked in his room, and there's this man. Tough, independent. He had flown 75 combat missions in a B-17 in World War II. He was a World War II hero. He'd written a book about it. And there he was, still couldn't walk, couldn't talk, and most upsetting to him, no control of his bodily functions. But his eyes were good, and his mind was good, and he saw me coming in, and he had something to say. Oh, and I forgot to tell you, on top of everything, he was deaf and would not wear his $5,000 hearing aids. So I go in, and he looks at me, and he gets this look on his face, and he forces out 3 words. Get me pills. And I looked at his face, and I knew exactly the kind of pills he wanted me to get him. And it wasn't aspirin. He wanted me to get him pills that would end his life. He did not want to hang around being dependent. And of course, as always with the deaf person, I had to yell my response. I said, Dad, I can't do that. I'll go to jail. No, not hell, Dad, jail. Well, maybe both. I can't do it. He did not care for that answer. So I didn't know what to do. I went to his doctor and I said, is there any way that we could possibly do something to help him restore his bodily function so at least he could pee? And he said, well, there is this operation we could do on his prostate. It might, about a 50-50 chance. And I said, well, let's try it. We got my dad to sign for it, and they did the operation. And 2 weeks later, my father could go to the restroom unassisted, and it made all the difference in the world. Suddenly, he did not want to kill himself. Isn't it a good thing I didn't get him those pills? Well, back in LA, I'm thinking, okay, no suicide. Yay, things are going to get better. Well, for a few weeks, and then about 4 weeks into rehab, I got the first of many parent-teacher calls, parent-teacher calls. The administrator of the rehab center called me and said, Jim, I'm sorry to tell you this, but we're going to have to expel your father for bad behavior. What? Yes, they were throwing my father out. He had been yelling at the nurses, and I'm afraid this good Sunday school teacher that he was not using Sunday school language. He'd been cursing at the nurses. I don't know why, but they were throwing him out. He said, you've got 1 week to find him a place to go. Okay, improvisation, right? So I go back to Austin yet again, and I look ahead, and there's only one place in town. This is 96. There was only one facility in town that had the continuum of care: independent living, assisted living, skilled nursing. One. So I get there in the morning, I go straight to that place, and I walk up to the admissions director. I say, hello, I need to have skilled nursing for mom. No, skilled nursing for dad, assisted living for mom, and I need it on Monday. And they looked at me like I had lost my mind. But they were Southern, and they were trying to be polite. And so she took me into her office. She said, well, let me just look in our books. And she didn't even have a computer. She had these giant books, and she was going through these 2 books. And all of a sudden, she got this look of happiness on her face. And she's kind of dancing around a little bit. And she acted like we had won the lottery. She said, we've got places on both spots on Monday. Well, of course, we had won the lottery. I was just so new at caregiving, I didn't realize it. That Monday, I was able to get mom in assisted living and dad 1 floor away in skilled nursing. And I headed back to LA yet again. And this went on for the next 6 months, back and forth, back and forth. But there were so many things that kept happening that I finally realized I just couldn't do what needed to be done from a distance of 1,000 miles. I had to make a decision. Either bring my parents out to California, where they knew nobody except me, and things were much, much more expensive, or quit my good job, leave my friends, my apartment, my church, and move back to Texas, where I hadn't lived in 30 years. And I didn't have any friends except for my cousins. No network, no job. It was a tough call, but I chose to come back and care for my parents, and it was the best decision I ever made. I do remember when I told my coworkers about what I was going to do, I can so remember they all said the right words. They were very supportive, and their mouths said the right words, but their eyes said something else. Their eyes said, oh God, please don't let this happen to me. But of course, as we all know, it happens to most of us. Well, I headed back to Texas, and I headed back to Texas in that pretty from October. But in the meantime, Woody Allen says that 80% of life is about showing up. Well, I showed up, but I didn't know what I was doing. I had no game plan. I had no way of really knowing what I was supposed to do, and my learning curve was steep. So that's why I eventually wrote this book that we talked about. I wrote it, and I give these speeches so that other people can learn from my mistakes and not make them, because it's not easy. It's not easy to become a caregiver overnight. Now, it would have been a lot easier if I'd been able to have a conversation with my father about this. But see, mother had already been I wasn't able to talk to her for a number of years about something like this, but my dad, for 4 or 5 years before his stroke, when I would come home to visit them, I would try to get him to talk about mother's condition, which he was in total denial about. He never said the A word in his life. And then I would try to get him to talk about his own future and what he would like as he got older and what would happen if there was a health issue. He would walk out of the room when I brought these up. Over and over again, this happened. He'd leave the room. I'm standing there. And sadly, I was the good boy and I didn't follow him. I now know I should have followed him out of the room. I should have cornered him and told him, we need to have this conversation, so I'll be ready to help you when the time comes. But I didn't do that. And sadly, many families, if not most families around America, don't have these important caregiving conversations where they get everything on the table and they find out what their parents want and don't want and can afford and can't afford and which children are going to show up and which ones are going to be missing in action. You know, all those important things. Most families don't have that conversation. They wait until there's a disaster, a health crisis, and then they talk about it, which is often too late. So I'm just telling you that for those of you who are caregivers now, it's too late for you to have that conversation with your parents, but I urge you to have it with your children. Now we're going to go over about 4 questions because in my book, I've got 50 questions that will save you time, money, and tears. All the questions that I did not know the answer to. And you know what's so interesting? I gave this speech to a group of caregiving professionals about 7 or 8 years ago. And there was a woman in the audience who ran a 300-person independent living. She'd been in long-term care for 20 years. Well, she bought my book, and that weekend, she sat down with her own parents, and they went over the 50 questions. And there's places to write the answers under each one. And she came to me a week later, and she said, Jim, I can't believe how much I didn't know. And I think that's true for all of us. Here are the first 4. Okay, number 1. Do your parents have a will, and do you know where it's kept? Now, I can't see your faces as much as I wish I could, because there's some of you are scrunching your faces up right now because you know they don't have a will. And if they do, you're not sure where it is. I'm urging you, if you can still get a will for them, they need one, and you certainly need to put it in a place where you know where it is. Now, an even more important question, and this is for caregivers and professionals, all of you. Do you have a will? And this is going to be a little interactive moment now. Kristen, we're going to take a little poll. Kristen, tell them what we're going to do.
So I just launched a poll on your screen, and it just asks, do you have a will? And you can select yes or no. It's totally anonymous. And we'll give it, 15, 20 seconds and see what the responses are.
Yeah, and I want every single person listening to fill that out. Now, come on, guys. This is the easiest multiple choice test you will ever have. You just got to answer it honestly. Answer it honestly, because we need to get a real feeling. Just answer it. Send those in. Are they coming in?
They are coming in. It looks like.
We're going to give you another 10 or 15 seconds. We want you to answer this. Great. I can't wait to see what the results are.
All right, I'm going to end the poll. It looks like it's about 50-50.
50-50?
48%.
What are the exact numbers?
48% do have a will, and 52% do not.
Okay, let me hear it. First of all, I want to thank you for your honesty. But I want you to hear those numbers. 48% have a will, yay. 52 don't. Now, what that tells me is that we have 52% of the people on this Zoom call who are immortal. Clearly, you're immortal because you're not going to die. You don't have a will. Come on, guys. You need to get one. Did you know that y'all are ahead of the national average. So I am going to congratulate you. You're a good bit ahead of the national average because nationally, 7 out of 10 Americans do not have a will. 7 out of 10. 10 out of 10 are going to die. I know because I Googled it, and Google doesn't lie. You realize that Prince, the great rock star who died about 3 or 4 years ago, had an estate of $250 million, $250 million. No will. Hard to even imagine. But he didn't. And his 4 brothers and sisters have been in court fighting about it ever since. Hasn't even been decided. Guy knows how much money they spent on lawyers. Aretha Franklin died of cancer a couple of years ago. She knew she was sick. $80 million estate. No will. Her kids are in court fighting. I do not want your heirs to be fighting over your millions. Or if you're like me, your thousands. I want that your estate to go to the people and causes that you want it to go to. But that will only happen if you have a will. So I urge you to do it. And you know, for those of you who are saying to yourself, oh, it's just too expensive, it's too much trouble. That is not true. If you don't have a big fancy estate, you can get one for $600 and you can do it in a couple of hours. So I urge you to take action on that. Okay, next question. Wills are not the only documents you need. How many of you have powers of attorney? Very important. Healthcare power of attorney allows someone that you choose, that you trust, to make healthcare decisions for you if you can't make them for yourself. And then durable powers of attorney allows them to make legal and financial decisions for you if you're not able to. And it's so important to choose someone you really know well and trust, and who does not have a vested interest in the outcome. Choose someone of the highest integrity to be your powers of attorney. Then, one of my favorites, living will. You know, so many people think if they just tell their family what they want at end of life, that they'll do that for them. That is just crazy. We all know what families are like. They all disagree and fight. One will say this and one will say, no. If you want to have any say in end of life decisions, you need to get it in writing. It has to be a legal form so that your living will can speak for you. Here's, for example, there's me. I do not want to be on a feeding tube. Maybe a couple of days, but more than a couple of days, I don't want to be in a feeding tube for months and months and months. No way. I've got that in my living will. Same thing with the respirator. If I got COVID and they put me on for a couple of weeks, okay, but I don't want to be on for months and months. That's no way of living. And if I had problems where my mind was no longer functioning, turn off the machine for me. That's my choice. Now, you may have a different point of view, but the point is you need to get it down in writing. And that even goes for how you want to be buried. I want to be cremated. I've got that down. I know where my ashes I want to go. I've got that down. And then there is the funeral or memorial service. Now, I'll never forget, it took me forever to ask my father about what he wanted in his service. I don't know why that was so hard. I mean, I was almost finished writing the book. I still hadn't asked him that question. I was on the last chapter. Finally, he's 94 years old. And I finally get with him and say, Dad, what do you want for your service? And he never forget what he said. He said, oh, Jim, do whatever you want. I won't be there. Was that a good answer? Of course, he's right. Then he topped it with an even better line. He said, funerals are for the living. See, my father was very mature. He didn't care. I, of course, am not as mature as my dad. I do care. I mean, I got to tell you, if someone was to play "You Light Up My Life" at my funeral, I would come down from heaven and zap them and raise hell. I don't want that. I have got down the songs and the music that I want and the readings and the people to give the eulogies. I've got all that down there so it will reflect me, even though, as my father said, I won't be there. Lastly, question number 4, one of my faves. Which of your siblings can you count on to help care for your parents? Well, you already know the answer to that question. And some of you are making a face right now. You're making this horrible face because your siblings aren't helping you. And others of you are smiling because your siblings are helping you. It's all over the map, isn't it? Well, I can't do much about that because that's already happened, hasn't it? Here's one piece of advice I've got about siblings. And this is based on stories I've heard as I gave this speech all over the country. I heard about this very kind of caregiver. I called them the drive-by sibling. This is the person who's got the fancy job in, Boston or New York or Albany or Buffalo, and they are not part of mom or dad's caregiving, but they do fly in once a year for maybe a day or a day and a half, and they look around and they sniff their nose and they criticize everything that the real caregiver is doing. You know those people? I know you do. Almost everybody's got one. They have absolutely no right to be critical because they don't know anything about it. The only time that these drive-by siblings have a right to speak is if they volunteer to come in for a week or two and give the real caregivers a break and do the work for a week or two. Then, once they've been in the, in the trenches of caregiving, then they have a right to make a comment, but not until then. So here's my advice to you. I'm giving you total permission. Pay no attention to them and don't let them bring you down because they don't know what they're talking about. All right, now that's the end of my sermon. We're going to go back to my story. It's October of 1996. I arrive in Texas with a crammed U-Haul, and I'm ready to be a caregiver. And by this time, my father has had a complete recovery. Once he could pee, he got serious. He was walking and talking just like he did before the stroke. And he was telling me how to drive just like he did before the stroke. He was so good that he had to leave the skilled nursing, and he was able to move him and my mother into a really wonderful independent living. And I got to tell you, my father had been a salesman. I do not know how he persuaded them to let him bring a woman with dementia into independent living, but he did it. He did it on a trial basis that lasted 5 years. My father was a great salesman. So by the time I got there, they were living on the 4th floor, had rooms right next to each other, looking over trees, beautiful. And of course, what I didn't understand, because this happened before I arrived, they put the telephone in the room of the deaf man. Yes, right. So what would happen is the phone would ring, he would not hear it, but my mother, great hearing next door, she'd hear the phone, she'd get her key to his room, she'd go out, she'd go to his room, open the door, walk in, answer the phone, hello. She would take the message in her beautiful handwriting, and then she would turn it to him, who could respond appropriately, and together they made one perfect person. So that's the situation when I arrived. And I had never been around Alzheimer's on a regular basis. Because you come for 4 or 5 days at Christmas, not the same at all. They can can't they do a great front at Christmas? They can fake it so well, they can make you think they're good at it. No, all of a sudden I saw the real thing. For example, my mother had about 60 dresses in her closet, but she would only wear 5. I mean, over and over, wore the same. And I said, Mom, why don't you wear the dress I gave you for your wedding anniversary? No, Jim, I can't wear that. It's stolen. Mama, these aren't stolen dresses. They're yours. No, they're not. If I wear those, they're going to put me in the hoosgow. Now, hoosgow is Texas for jail. And she really thought that if she wore her own dresses, they were going to put her in jail because they were stolen. And no logic was going to dissuade her from that, as I quickly learned. And then came the day that changed everything. Mother asked if she could go see her sister, Estelle, in Smithville. Now, there's only one slight problem with that request. Estelle had been dead for 8 years, and I foolishly made the mistake of telling my mother that. I said, Mama, we can't go see Estelle. She's in heaven. Well, that was absolutely breaking news to my mother. She heard that. She started crying, sobbing. Her shoulders were shaking, tears coming. She cried for 15 minutes. And I just sat there watching her, knowing, my goodness, what have I done? I just told the truth. Well, sometimes the truth is not the thing to tell. So the next day, I made an appointment with an Alzheimer's specialist that I was referred to. And I walked into her office and said, I don't think I can do this. She said, from what I hear, you don't have much choice. Of course, she was right. Then she gave me the single best advice I ever got about caregiving, bar none. She said, and I quote, quit trying to drag your mother into your world. She can't go there anymore. You must go into her world. Go into her world. Well, I got it. I heard her, it made sense, and I started doing it from that day. And I did it for the next 14 years. And it made all the difference. Instead of me trying to make mother be what she couldn't be, I met her where she was, which is really all we can do. And for the first 5 years, pretty much, mother was still pretty sharp and had a great sense of humor. It was fun to be with. The first 5 years were pretty easy, but as time went on and her cognitive abilities declined, I tried to match her where she was. And then about 8 or 9 years in, there came the day when I showed up to see her and she looked at me and all of a sudden, blank. She had no idea who I was. I knew that day was coming, but it didn't feel good. I'll admit that. But again, I had to deal with what was, not what I wanted to be. So here was my improvisational response. I said, Mama, Jim Comer, your firstborn, good to see you. Shook her hand, gave her a kiss. She looked up to me. She always liked attention, and she smiled, and she warmed up to the stranger. And that's what I did for the rest of the time. I just kept reintroducing myself to my mother, and she didn't know me, but she liked me. And that's all that counted. And then later on, as she lost speech altogether, I just tried to relate to her in the things I knew she liked. Riding in the car, singing. She liked to hear me sing, thank goodness. Going to the garden, eating ice cream. We did the things that made her happy, even without speech. You see, that the truth is, we have got to try to be what they need. We need to be whatever our parents need for them to be. We need to go into their world, even when it's not easy. And, you know, I have seen that happen so many times. I've seen adult caregivers, otherwise really well-meaning caregivers, but I've seen them out in public with someone who's really older, probably a mother or father, who has dementia. And I've literally heard this conversation more than I wish I had. It goes like this. It goes, Mama, I just told you that. I told you that 3 times in a row. Why don't you remember, Mama? I just told you. Ever heard that conversation? Ever said it? I know. It's hard not to. It's hard not to. But here's the deal. If they could remember, they would remember. I had lots of experience with dealing with that, going into their world. Because my mother, suppose the first 4 or 5 years, every time I'd come to see her, she had one memory about me that was firmly in her mind, and she would ask it almost every time I came. Because I'm sorry to say, it's a true confession, I was infamous for running out of gas. I mean, I ran out of gas all the time. I don't know what was going on, but I ran out of gas a lot, and my mother had that in her mind. So I would show up to see her, and within 5 minutes, she'd say, Jim, how are you fixed for gas? Now, don't you lie to your mama. You have gas in that gas tank? And of course, I would lie and say, oh, yes, mother, full tank. I just filled it up, absolutely. But once she got that in her mind, she might ask that same question 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in one visit. And it was my job to answer it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in one visit without attitude or comment. I must admit, I was successful about 95% of the time, not always. Here's the deal. When we are faced with the choice of them being right, getting a fact right, remembering a name, whatever, them being right, and us being kind, go for kind every single time. You just can't go wrong by being kind. I was so lucky that my mother had the great sense of humor. Oh my, if she'd been a comedy writer, we'd all been rich. For example, I once came into her room to see her, and I don't know, my shoes were all scuffed up. Maybe they had some mud on them. I don't know what, but her excellent eyesight, she saw those muddy shoes. She looked at me, she said, Jim, those shoes are a scandal to the jaybirds. Now that's an East Texas expression that means not good. And so I said, now Mama, don't be upset. I'm gonna get some new shoes when I'm rich. And then she scrunched up her face and she said, oh, Jim, don't wait that long. I wonder how she knew. And then there was this 92-year-old man who lived in the independent living with them, and he just thought my mother was fabulous. Every time I walked through the lobby, he would come up to me, he would rave on about my mother's charms. And this went on for months and months. I mean, I could barely get across without him coming through. And so finally I thought, Mother needs to know that she has an admirer. So I said one day, I said, Mama, do you know there's a 92-year-old man who thinks you are terrific? And she said, honey, that's the kind I attract. I mean, you've got to love somebody who's got that kind of one-liners. Then there was my father. Deaf, demanding, defiant. And I had no idea how much he liked his scotch. I mean, I knew he liked it. I just didn't know he liked it. And he, pretty soon, found a World War II buddy who lived on the 2nd floor. And many a night, Dad would go from the 4th floor down to his buddy in the 2nd floor, and they would refight the war and drink a little, actually a lot of scotch. And then around 10:30, after Germany had been defeated yet again, Berlin had fallen, Hitler had put a bullet through his brain, my father would try, in his inebriated state, to get back to his room. And he would head down that long, long, wall-to-wall carpeted hallway. And he would usually make it, but a couple of times he didn't. He would look down at that thick carpet, and it just called to him. It said, come to me. Come. And he would lie down on the carpet and totally go out. I mean, just sound asleep. Well, a few minutes later, someone would come along and see this body, and they would think, dead, stroke, heart attack. They would call the front desk. The front desk would call the EMS. EMS would send an ambulance, and they would rush him to the emergency room. And when they got there, the doctors were waiting. Diagnosis, bombed. And of course, I would get parent-teacher call. Parent-teacher call. Jim, what are you going to do about your dad's drinking? What do you tell a 90-year-old about drinking? It's going to stunt your growth? I don't think so. And this happened twice in 1 year. I was worried. I was afraid they would kick us out because, as you know, we'd been kicked out of other places. So I made an appointment with the administrator of independent living, a Methodist minister, and because this was a Methodist home, and I took him to lunch, and I turned to him and said, what should we do about Dad's drinking? And he looked at me and he said, Jim, I admire your father so much. What he did in World War II, 75 combat missions out of England and Italy, the heart of the war. He wrote a book about it afterwards. I mean, he's a hero. And then the way he cares for your mother, he's so good about taking care of her, making it possible for her to live here. And if it takes him a little scotch to do it, it's okay with me. I could not believe that response, especially coming from a Methodist minister, but that is what he said. However, there were some other little, and Dad never passed out again, but there were other little incidents. And so I finally realized we need to cut off the booze. So then I had to find out who's supplying him, because it wasn't me, and he didn't drive. He wasn't doing it. Somebody was bringing in the booze. So you know what I did? I went to the source of all knowledge on the 4th floor. The maid. I asked the maid if she had any idea how the booze got in there. She said, oh yeah, of course. I said, what? Tell me. She said, that guy that used to live on the 2nd floor that was your dad's good friend, well, he moved out. But he comes and visits your dad, and when he comes, he brings him some scotch. Well, I didn't know that. So I got it. She also had his phone number. I got the guy's phone number. I called him up. I said, Dad is cut off. Then I thought, well, I need to probably get rid of whatever supply he has in his closet. I expected maybe, a fifth or something. So I go to visit him while he's watching Lawrence Welk and not paying attention. And I got into the closet. Behind his boots, 2 half-gallons of Dewar's. So I sneaked those out into the hallway. Dad didn't see it. And I don't drink. So that night I was going to a party and I brought a big hostess gift. I gave him all that scotch. My friends were thrilled. And I kept waiting for Dad to say something about it. And he never did. And the booze problem was over. Again, one more time, improvisation. There are no rules, anywhere to tell you what to do in a situation like that. You have to trust your gut, do the best you can, improvise, and you'll be okay. Well, things were going pretty well, with the exception of, my father passing out. Overall, things were going pretty well those first 5 years in independent living. And I got a false sense of security. I even started working on this book. And I'm thinking, I can do this. I got this down. Now, there were occasional surprises. Like, I'll never forget one Sunday, I always came for lunch on Sunday noon because that was the best meal of the week, bar none. And one day I'm sitting there, my father's right by me. I had just gotten this big plate of food. I had the first bite of pot roast on its way to my mouth. And as it's on its way, my father says, Jim, I want you to give me an enema after lunch. There went my appetite. I had never signed up for enema giving, but I said, okay. And let's just say I gave it my best, and my best was deemed not very good by my father, and he never asked for that service again. So we're going along pretty well, and it's Christmas Eve 2000. And my mother gets up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and she trips and falls in her room and breaks her hip. The next morning, Christmas Eve morning, we're all at the hospital. They take her in for an operation. And of course, she's out of her mind for a couple of days with the anesthetic, as older people usually are. And the next day in the hospital, they put her dentures that she's had for like 30 years or more. They put them on the tray, with her food. And some foolish person came and emptied the tray into the dumpster. And despite the fact that we looked for hours and hours, we never found her dentures again. So in the space of just 2 days, she lost the ability to walk and to chew. And of course, they sent her to rehab, but with her dementia, she wasn't able to make it in rehab. And so they told me, you've got 1 day to find a bed for her in a nursing home. And it was Christmas. They were packed. And the place I wanted her to go, there was only 1 bed in the entire place, and it was in a room with 3 other people. Well, my ego was Not happy about that. Of course, mother, do you think she cared that she was going to be with 3 other people? Not at all. But I was concerned because they had just gone from the 4th floor overlooking trees to the 1st floor with 3 roommates overlooking the garbage and the back driveway. I wasn't happy. But this is one more time where you just have to make a decision to show up. Just a decision. I had to realize that, yes, this is not what I want, but it's what is. It's where we are right now. And so I could, over the next week or two, I saw that mother was getting better, that she was perfectly shy. She was in that room 9 years. Because I soon realized that she was right across from the nursing station, and that was a great place to be for good care. So I never moved her. She never commented on a roommate in 9 years. As far as she was concerned, it was her room. The problem was mine. And I, over the coming weeks, got over it because I saw the good care she was getting. I began to get to know the other families that had people in that room and on the floor. And I began to get to know the residents, and I got over it. I made a conscious choice to get over it and become a part of that community. And if we had time, which we don't, I would tell you about having me sing at their Mother's Day celebration, which was a giant mistake on their part, but that's another time. So mother's there, she's in A-Wing. You're not gonna believe this. 7 months later, on July 4th, we were big on holidays that year, my father fell in his room in the middle of the night, going to the bathroom, and he broke his hip. Same hospital, same doctor, same operation, same rehab. And then they sent him to the nursing home. Well, mother was on A-Wing. And here's the deal. She'd been married at this point almost 60 years. And this was the first time she had been on her own. And she liked it. She liked it a lot. Nobody was telling her what to do, and she was getting lots of attention from the nurses' aides. She was happy. So I thought, well, I'm going to put Dad on B-Wing. And so he's on B-Wing, and he tells me, I'm going back to independent living. I'm going to do all these exercises. I'm going to get well. I'm going to go back. So we held his room in independent living, and he worked so hard on that rehab. He did everything they told him to do, all the exercises, everything. And he kept telling me, I'm getting it, I'm going to be okay. And after about 3 months, they came to me. They said, Jim, he has to stay here. He can't dress himself. He can't do all of his toileting. He just can't. He needs to be here. He needs care. And you have to tell him. Not my favorite conversation. I had to tell Dad that he had to stay, and he was depressed, and I was depressed. And so I went to the medical director. I said, can we have some Prozac? He said, oh, sure, I'll be glad to get your dad some Prozac. No, not my dad, me. So he gave us both Prozac, and we chilled on out. Well, I've got 5 minutes left here, so I'm going to tell you one of my favorite stories. My mother's 90th birthday came about, 7 or 8 months later. And at this point, I would just have my parents meet in the living area. So I had not had him come to where she was on A-Wing. I would have them meet in neutral areas. Because you have to realize, he couldn't hear and she couldn't remember. So the conversations were somewhat limited. So on her 90th birthday party, I had a big deal. I had about 70 people there. There must have been 50 wheelchairs from all over the place, all the relatives, cake, ice cream, piano player, singer. It was fabulous. And after the party was over, I turned to my father, because even if you're in your 50s, you still want your parents' approval. I did. I said, well, Dad, how did you like the party? He said, well, that was all right, except for all the old people. He was 91 and a half, but he was not an old people. Well, that was the first time he'd ever been to A-Wing. He went back to B-Wing. See, I made a little mistake. I forgot how brilliant he was. He memorized the route to my mother's room after going one time. And it's a complicated route. It took me weeks to get it, but he got it the first time. So the next morning, Monday morning, in the middle of the lunch rush, he wheels himself all around in bed. And he goes to my mother's room and he grabs her wheelchair and he starts pulling her. Come on with me. I want you to come to my room. Come with. And she's going, no, no, help. No. She's knocking trays and screaming. Oh my God. All of a sudden, parent teacher call. Parent, Jim, your father's raising hell in A-Wing. What are you going to do? Improvisation. So I go, well, what do I do? I came up with an idea. I went to my computer. I wrote new rules for the nursing home. Mother is happy in A-Wing. They're taking wonderful care of her. She's not wandering. She's very safe. You don't have to worry about her. A list of all positive things. I printed it out, big print. Go to my father, make him put on his glasses, put on his hearing aids. We go over the list several times. I say, do you understand? He said, absolutely. I went to myself, I went, great. And then he said, I only want one thing. I want it signed by the commandant. Then I realized World War II commandant, that means the top guy. Oh, he means the nursing home administrator. So I take that paper, I find the nursing home administrator. He's in a meeting. I get him out of the meeting. I tell him it's an emergency. He comes, he stands in front of my father, and he signs the piece of paper. And then he goes back to his meeting. That's what I call a good nursing home administrator. He put his priorities first. And I gave that to my father. He folded it. He put it in the little chest right by his bed. And he never bothered my mother again. Now, that's a good improvisation. They don't all work that well, as we all know, but that one worked. I want to end by another story that Dory told me about a wife who is in caring for her husband at home, and they live about 45 minutes from Plattsburgh, and she doesn't feel comfortable in driving that distance. So she hadn't been going to any of the caregiver events or the support group, even though she wanted to. She just couldn't go. And then when COVID-19 came along, they began having the support group meetings on phone. And so she could phone in and join the support group. And it has made all the difference in the world for her, because now she gets to be a part of the group and ask questions and get to know the other people and learn from them and share with them. And it's been great. COVID-19 has actually helped her as a caregiver. But what I think it's important for you to know, no matter what the situation, the Caregiver Support Initiative is going to do their very best to help you deal with whatever situation you've got. I want to close by just emphasizing that my time as a caregiver was so important to me. I learned so much. For one thing, I learned that caregiving is an art, not a science. I learned that dignity comes in many shapes, including bent and wrinkled and walker assisted. I learned that patience is the currency of love. And I learned a new word, unselfish. I assure you, it had never been in my vocabulary before. I had been the most self-centered person on the planet. But caregiving helped me experience a little of that unselfish word. And that was a good thing for me. And I guess that most of all, I'm just glad that I was able to show up for my folks when they needed me. And it must have helped, because Dad lived to be 96 and Mother lived to be 97. You know, the great British poet Wordsworth said, the best part of a good person's life are the little unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Little unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Well, that's what caregivers do every day. That's what you do. And I believe that caregiving is God's work, and that when we show up, for the people we love, we're letting God's light shine through us. I've been so happy to be with you today, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Jim. I really learned a lot from listening to you, and I think everyone else did as well. There's lots of gems of wisdom we can take away from that speech.
Well,
Anyone
thank you.
has any questions, feel free to type them in either to the chat box or the Q&A feature. I do have a few. So
Okay.
the first one is, what is the most important piece of advice you have for professionals who are working with people with dementia or with caregivers of people with dementia?
I think the most important advice I've got would be to not go by the rules, but go by your heart. Sort of like the administrator that left his meeting to come sign the form. The other administrator that told me, listen, if your father needs a little scotch, it's okay with me. Mm-hmm. The ones that let my parents into independent living, even when they didn't quite qualify. Over and over again, kindness. There's nothing more important than kindness. Sure, rules are important, I get it, but rules are not the ultimate answer. The ultimate answer is the love and caring and kindness that professional caregivers bring to both the residents, those who are suffering from dementia, as well as their caregivers. I think that's the most important thing you can give them.
Absolutely, and it ties right into improvising too.
Everything. If there was a through line, as I heard myself, I kept saying improvise over and over again, because that's what you do. There are no rules for all the things that are going to come up. There's no way. You are going to sure, there's some things that people can tell you stuff that you can get ready for, but there are going to be bunches of things that no one could have ever prepared you for, and that's when you've got to use your wits, and you're going to have to maybe ask for help or just come up with the best thing you could do. Sometime it'll work, sometime it won't. Then you try something else.
And someone's sharing in the comments right now that that's spot on. Kindness goes a long way, and flexibility is crucial, which is
flexibility is so crucial. I mean, I was so much more. I was much more able to be relaxed and much more able to go with the flow after a few years of practicing this. I didn't think things had to be a certain way. I did the best I could. Sometimes the best you could is just great. Doesn't have to be perfect. I still remember going to a caregivers group. This is 15 years ago. And they were going around this room and they were talking about it, and they were being so hard on themselves. And I finally interrupted and I said, guys, look what you're doing. You're showing up for your parents and your husbands and your wives. You're doing great. And you don't have to be perfect. Forget perfect. That is not happening. Perfect is not part of the deal. You're doing the best you can in a very difficult situation. And
absolutely.
Give yourself some slack.
Mm-hmm. Give yourself grace. I say that all the time in support group. To give yourself grace.
Yes.
To the caregivers that I meet with in support group.
So often we think we've got to live up to this imaginary gold standard that nobody lives up to.
Right. Absolutely.
So I think that trying to do the best you can, even when you screw up, like for me, when Mother first went into the nursing home, I had a month where I wasn't too great, but I got over it because I chose to get over it and learn from what was around me.
Right. And that's so important to remember. My last question is, what advice or piece of wisdom do you have for someone who is feeling totally burnt out right now, a caregiver who's just so stressed?
I get it. And I especially get it right now, because as I said at the beginning of the talk, you're not only dealing with regular caregiving, you're dealing with COVID-19. Yeah. And it's going on longer than we thought. And it looks like it's going to go on a good bit longer, I'm sad to say. So that's I'm just living here, living out of a home office, I deal with it and I feel burned out. So I can't even imagine. So what I would say is, ask for any help you can get. If there's anybody in your life, family, friends, church group, anybody who can even give you a couple of hours break, maybe once a week, maybe twice a week, ask for it. It is not a sign of weakness to ask for help. In fact, it's a sign of mental health to ask for help. Because the ones who really burn out are the ones who think they've got to do it all. They can't ask for help. Well, that's ridiculous. So I'm saying to you, the person who had that question, think about the people in your life who care about you and who might be able to give you some sort of break. Yeah. And if you can hire somebody to come in and give you some break, that's another possibility. But ask around. Look at your church. Look at your community. What kind of resources does the city have? Look for places where you can get some help.
Absolutely. Nobody can do the caregiving 100% on their own.
Absolutely not. No.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to thank you again, Jim, for coming on Zoom today to do
I loved it.
Presentation. I think this was fabulous, and thank you everyone who called in or is watching right now. I hope you learned a lot, and we're excited to still be able to do these meetings virtually. So thank you.
Well, I want to thank those who invited me to come. I think Valerie might have been the one, since she was my contact 4 years ago. I want to thank her for giving them my name.
Yes. Well, thank you all, and I hope you take care.
Okay. Bye, everybody.